Time to get started with news of the day. Oh, we got some good stuff for you today. So I'm looking forward to getting into it. So let's go. Remember, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat about any of these news items or anything else. Before we get started, let's just look at markets for a moment. This table shows how I look at global markets. The most important thing you can see is that year to date, the top line world is up 8.7%. Now, on the week, emerging Asia was up 3.3%. Japan was up 2.6%, rebounding from recent weakness. Now, that recent weakness, if you look on a 3-month basis, Asia has recently been hit on the emerging markets, but it's starting to come back. Now, the U.S., meaning mainly North America, still is the strongest one-year performer, up 41%. In fact, the U.S. is the best up 3 years and 5 years. We definitely have had a U.S.-dominated world over the last 3 years and 5 years. Let's take a look at countries across Asia here. And here you can see that weekly strength right now is in North Asia. We're talking about China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. Year-to-date strengths in Taiwan and Hong Kong, they're both up about 10%. And Indonesia has been hardest hit. Philippines and Indonesia. Philippines down 13%. I was recently on a TV show in the Philippines talking about how brutally painful it has been. Now, you can see also that Thailand is starting to get weak. We can see Thailand is down 0.4 in this week. It has been a pretty rough start to this quarter for Thailand. And finally, let's look at currencies. The key thing that you can see on this, a few things that I would highlight, is that we've got weekly strength in India. Dollar weakness means euro strength. So it's almost just the opposite between the dollar index and the euro, given the weightings of these two currencies. And also, year to date, the weakest in Asia was the Thai baht. The Thai government has been shutting down the economy. There's no return of tourism, that's for sure. And economy is just shut on a lot of types of businesses, restaurants, coffee shops, hotels. All of these businesses are really struggling under the pressures of the government, and that is weakening the currency. We can also see that thanks to China basically has been the strongest, and we can see year to date up about 1.4 for the Chinese yuan, and the dollar is down about 9.5 over the past year. And for the past year, we can see when the dollar is down, the renminbi is up for China. And so the relationship here between dollar and the Chinese currency is very, very strong. The point is that I've been talking about the idea of inflation happening in America. It may be short-lived, but right now we're playing that through commodities, but also the fact that there's so much debt in America at the government level as well as at the company level and at the consumer level, that at some point, I believe the pressure, it may not come on the U.S. stock market, but I believe it will come on the dollar. And it's already happening over the past year. The dollar's down almost 10% versus the yuan, which is up. The Chinese renminbi is up about 10% also. So let's get started with the first news of the day. The Wall Street Journal reports that intelligence on 6 staff at Wuhan lab fuels debate on COVID-19 origin. It says it's a news exclusive, but haven't we known a lot about this already? A report reveals 6 researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. A previously undisclosed U.S. report reveals that 3 researchers from the Wuhan lab fell seriously ill before the coronavirus outbreak. The Biden administration is seriously considering whether there is substantial evidence to back the lab leak theory. Now, Chinese Foreign Ministry claims the U.S. continues to hype the lab leak theory. If Biden continues to support and investigate it, the U.S. tensions could rise. Now, this is a really important story, and the reason why it's important, in my opinion, is that, first of all, it's not a lab leak theory, it's a lab leak hypothesis, meaning it's an idea. And as an idea, it needs to be tested before it could be considered a theory, and certainly far away from having certainty on it. The thing that's been so painful about this is that the whole thing has been politicized. And the reality is that for the good, common good of the world, it would be good to know how this happened, why this happened so that we can prevent it. Unfortunately, up until now, because of politics, it just was not able to be discussed. The Democrats in the U.S. would not allow it to be discussed. You could get kicked off of social media if you even said that it was happening. And on the Republican side, they kept pushing that this is it because Trump was saying it and others. The truth is that science is brilliant. Science is neutral. Let science try to go in and try to figure out what happened and look for evidence and clues. Let's go on to the next one. Belarus diverts Ryanair flight to arrest journalists, the opposition say. This is a BBC article, and Roman Protasevich is an activist and journalist who fled Belarus in 2019. He was recently on board a plane from Greece to Lithuania before the flight was diverted to Belarus. No reports have been given on his current state. The president, Lukashenko, is known to have jailed prominent challengers. European nations and prominent leaders reacted with outrage against Belarus's actions. Russia backs the Belarus government while the US and EU support the opposition. Tension inside Belarus could escalate, and it could even spark some proxy warfare between the US and Russia. This is a really extreme thing for a government to go after a private company and down an airliner to try to go after a dissident or an opposition leader. And so it'll be interesting to see how this unfolds. But let's look at the Financial Times article. It talks about China's top diplomat heads to Russia as ties reach best level in history. Beijing and Moscow sense an opportunity in the face of fading U.S. influence and COVID fallout. Face of fading U.S. influence. Last week, Xi Jinping and Putin attended a virtual summit launch of a nuclear energy project. The deal, signed in 2018, entails Russia helping China to build 4 nuclear reactors. Xi Jinping spoke of a comprehensive strategic partnership for a new era, and Putin claimed ties had reached the best level in history. The nuclear deal is part of China's strategy to reduce reliance on coal and achieve carbon emissions at net levels to 0 by 2060. Right now, China is the world's biggest consumer of coal. As China and Russia relations strengthens, this could further deepen tensions with the U.S. My contention from the beginning is that the U.S. basically was already going after Russia and China to an extent. When Trump came in, what we saw is the Democrats grabbed the Russian narrative that Russia was behind. There was collusion between Russia and Trump, and they just would not let it go. And that damaged relationships between the U.S. and Russia to an extreme. The other actions is the U.S. has been using financial sanctions against Russia, Russian leaders, Russian businesses, and ultimately the heavy-handed uses of those sanctions is ultimately, if anybody did it to the U.S., it would be considered an act of war. So Russia does not appreciate it, and basically America is using a huge amount of power that it has to an extent that they're driving their enemies away. And of course, during the Trump time, there became this whole anti-Chinese aspect and Chinese business with Chinese. And so that's another aspect. And there's no doubt that these two countries are going to come together with a common enemy, meaning the U.S. Neither, in my belief, I've never been to Russia, but I have been to China quite a bit. And in my belief, neither of these countries want a war with America. And they would cooperate and get along. But I believe that the hostility coming out of America is so strong that it's going to keep the tensions high. Next story from MarketWatch. Treasury wants businesses to report Bitcoin and Dogecoin transactions over $10,000. Well, the Treasury Department wants reporting to the IRS on large cryptocurrency transactions. This is part of a broader Biden administration effort to raise tax revenue, and the tougher tax enforcement also allows for a better understanding of where money is going to in this cryptocurrency space. Along with China's recent crackdown on cryptocurrencies, the recent report may continue to hurt the volatile crypto market. This may adversely lead to a rise in gold prices, as it's often considered a valuable asset to hold in turbulent times. Now, this story has a lot to it. The point is that, first of all, the U.S. government uses the banks to basically control the flow of money. And the way they do that is minimum transactions. Once there's a transaction over $10,000, it has to be reported to the federal government, basically. And the result of that is that the banks report all kinds of suspicious activity to the federal government. Basically, they are almost like a spying arm of the U.S. government. And now what the U.S. government is saying, well, we want the same in the cryptocurrency markets. Now, isn't the cryptocurrency markets, aren't they supposed to be decentralized and the government can't control them? Well, the government can control cryptocurrency exchanges, and that's where most of the transactions are happening. And they can require cryptocurrencies exchanges to report all of this information about all of the users. So for those people that think that crypto can stay out of the hands of the government, I doubt it. I suspect both the U.S. government and other governments are going to try to get their hands into it. One reason why they want to get their hands into it is get the information about who's moving money. And then the second reason why is taxes. There's a huge amount of people that have been getting gains in the crypto market, and in the end, they basically have a lot of capital gains that they would need to pay. So let's look at the last story. BlackRock joins funds betting on Indian assets amid outbreak. Bloomberg reports that that institutional investor BlackRock is buying into undervalued Indian companies impacted by COVID-19. Asset managers have placed long positions on sustainable energy and renewable energy companies. The index in India has been rising due to India's recovery, and however, not all companies have fully recovered, which could make them attractive. Investors could buy companies producing biopharmaceuticals, finished metal products, or chemicals. So here we can see that there's starting to be more flows. And I would say, from my perspective, I would expect more flows into Asia coming out of the U.S. as the U.S. is at a peak in valuation, number one. And number two, we can see the weakness in the U.S. dollar. Think about the U.S. dollar over the last year. It lost 9.5% of its value. So if you converted your own home currency and put it into the U.S. stock market over the last year, you may have gotten a 10% return in the market, but you also lost 10% on the currency when you convert that back to your home currency. And it's that kind of transactions and that type of currency move that's going to basically hurt external investors, foreign investors that are investing into the U.S. Let's see if we've got any questions. Well, first of all, there's Hillary. Good morning. Good to chat on the on LinkedIn. I hope you don't lose hope. Keep up hope. And let's go on now. Titigon says, do you think the coronavirus is a kind of bioweapon under development that accidentally leaked? It's possible. I would say, I think the beauty of science is you can't rule out any hypothesis. That could be a hypothesis, but we'd have to try to prove that. I think it would be very hard to prove, because if it was done by the U.S. intelligence, I know against another country, they would have done everything to keep everything about it very, very confidential. So I would say that's a hard thing to investigate, but it's very possible. You know, one of the things that's interesting is that, you know, we know that COVID has hit hard on people who are suffering from obesity. And we also know that the U.S. is a country that has a high level of obesity. So if it was targeted at any particular country, you could easily say that the U.S., you know, is a potential target. All right. Pornprom says, it's a shame the outbreak situation is politicized and true. People deserve to know how it happened. I'm glad I attended your live session in time. Great to have you with us. Yes, we don't need politics in that. In fact, politicians love to fight. Average people just want to get along. So next question comes from Marut. What are some market trends for Q2? That's a good question. Well, already we're seeing, from my perspective, weakness in the US dollar is a significant thing. I think that the trend that I'm playing right now is two trends. Number one, inflation, trade, and I'm doing that through commodities. The second is emerging markets and Asia, which I think are going to outperform the US. And that's why I've got that two trades on, both And that basically means that I've reduced exposure to the US market, which has hurt me over the last, let's say, 12 months or 6 months. But I believe that the trade going forward will continue to be commodities in Asia. Ravi says, do you see Russia-China relationship to ripple in Asia, or could we see a new non-aligned movement in Asia? I think that Russia's presence in Asia is kind of minimal. So I think that we can't really expect that Russia is going to have a presence in Asia. But I do think that this can strengthen the relationship with Russia, as well as China trying to stand up, will strengthen China's influence throughout Asia, and it will weaken the US. And that's the reason why I felt like the US using financial incentives, financial sanctions against Russia was just overdone, and they beat it so hard. All right. Munling says, do you think we will see a stronger alliance between America and Europe to counter the China-Russia relations? Yes and no. I mean, there's a part of Europe, I know when Trump was in office, that Europe didn't want to cooperate. For instance, on the Iran deal, when Trump backed out of the Iran deal, Europe was trying to figure out ways to maintain the relationship with Iran. And basically the US tried to stop that by saying, if you do anything with those Iranian companies, that the US is going to sanction you, as meaning a European country. And also, you know, Europe is seeing that there's a lot of tension being brought to the borders of NATO, basically the NATO alliance. They know what's going on, and I would argue that that makes things less safe for them. So I'm not sure, you know, if it came to war, I suspect Europe would side with America. But without that, just tensions, I would expect that, you know, that Europe is going to try to be independent to some extent. Okay, Titigon says, do you think Bitcoin is just a massive Ponzi scheme? Well, Ponzi scheme means basically that the money coming in is being used to pay the people that are basically prior owners. That's a Ponzi scheme, and generally this is not a Ponzi scheme. It's just a matter of whether there's real value to Bitcoin or not. Now, you could say that from an intrinsic valuation perspective, it's very hard to say that it has any real value. From a currency perspective, that it could replace the current currency, well, you could argue that it's extremely volatile. And so therefore, you know, it doesn't really serve a function as a currency. But I would say it's not a Ponzi scheme. We know exactly what it is. Ponzi scheme also, there's fraud involved where the person perpetrating the Ponzi scheme behind the scenes is manipulating, and they're showing results, like Bernie Madoff as an example, that are not true results. I believe that the results you see with Bitcoin and all of the you know, the blockchain related to Bitcoin, you know, is real. All right. What are your thoughts on the virus leak report? Well, I mean, I think that there's plenty of ability for that hypothesis, that hypothesis to be true. I mean, why would it? We know that the bats were down in where is it? Yunnan. They weren't in Wuhan. So for it to occur naturally in Wuhan didn't make sense. So I would say there's enough of a thought or an energy, a thinking process that could get us to that lab leak hypothesis. All right, next one. Let's see. Raoult says, thoughts on how the international community is going to react to Belarus situation. It's very interesting. You know, there was another case where the US forced a plane to land and be inspected over Europe. I don't know if you remember that, but that was the plane that they suspected was flying from Russia to Ecuador. And that was a plane that was supposed to have Edward Snowden on it. And the US forced that plane to land. So from a purely hypocritical perspective, you could say US already did that. But of course, the US doesn't see things that way. They see themselves as the right group. But the point is that I suspect the tension between Russia and the US will be high. And now that Biden's in power, I suspect that the influences within the State Department in the US is going to try to push for an overthrow of the Belarus government in hopes that they can get their people into it, the people they support. Munling says, do you think the crypto market is still valuable if governments are intervening in such transactions? I think that this has always been the risk with the crypto, and that is how can the governments get their hands on it? I never, ever, I mean, my rule, Munling, is never trust government. Is it clear? Never trust government. They're not necessarily out for your good. They oftentimes don't bring you good. And their interests are so powerful that they can do anything they want, and they can deal with they let you deal with the consequences. So I would say that governments do not like cryptocurrencies taking away the power that they may have with their own underlying currency, particularly the US. US is at the biggest threat in that case. So I think that there's risks. There's definitely risks. We've already seen countries that have banned cryptocurrency exchanges. I believe it was Nigeria that banned cryptocurrencies exchanges and wouldn't let banks allow transactions with those companies. Let's go to the next one. Yeah, Pawn Prom says, I've been watching Indian stock market as well. However, the price gain seems to front run the real economic activity. Yeah, I think that that's probably true. Now, the problem you have with India is just the opposite of the US, or sorry, of China. They both have a huge number of shares, but almost all of the Chinese stocks are large and liquid, and almost none of the Indian stocks are large and liquid. I'd like to just go back for a moment, back to the beginning of this presentation when we talked about the market movements. And those market movements, let me just hide that chat. Those market movements are shown in this slide. And sorry, the next one. Yeah. So here we can see that the Indian market is up 7.9% year to date. And that is in line with Taiwan and Hong Kong and Singapore. So yes, it has been performing relatively well. And we can see over a year about 60%. So yes, it's quite possible. And already, I don't have the PEs. I think tomorrow I'll add in some valuations, but I know that the valuation of India is pretty expensive. So I do think that you could be right in the sense that the market is moving faster than the recovery that's happening on the ground. All right. And Hillary says, what about the doctors that were disappeared? Yeah, that's another aspect of what happened in China, where there was some doctors that they couldn't find, or they were disappearing. I don't know all the details of that, but I do recall one in particular that was sounding an alarm that ended up passing away himself. So lots of good questions. Beginning of this thing, I talked about market movements, region movements, and currency movements. If you like that and you like what you're getting, give me some feedback, and let's keep this train rolling. I hope you have a great, great day.